Hey guys, this is Daniel from What Obi Plays, and today I'm very excited because I just got the AYANEO Flip 1S DS in the mail. I haven't even opened it yet, so we're going to do a live unboxing and I'm going to give you my raw, unfiltered impressions on the device as well as some of the accessories I bought. This is also the most expensive AYANEO handheld I bought, and I'm very curious as to how their top line performs since I'm very happy with the other AYANEO devices I currently own. The Flip 1S DS is AYANEO's second generation dual screen Windows-based handheld, and it has the powerful AMD Ryzen HX 370 processor with up to 30 watts TDP, up to 64 gigabytes of RAM at 7500 megatransfers, up to 2 terabytes of 2230 UFS 4.0 storage, TMR sticks and Hall triggers, a 45 watt-hour battery, and a 7-inch 144 1080p OLED top display, and a 4.5 1620 by 1080 3x2 LCD bottom display. I believe these are the same screens as the Pocket Evo and Pocket Ace, but we'll do some comparisons since I have both of those devices. My unit is the top unit, which comes in the Retro Power colorway and has 64 gigabytes of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage. I'll also do some comparisons with my other AYANEO devices, especially the screens on the Pocket Evo and the Pocket Ace, as well as compare the Hinge to the Nintendo DS Lite and the new 3DS, and also the 1X Player F1 Pro. I do want to keep this video primarily focused on the Flip 1S, so subscribe if you want to see an in-depth comparison against the F1 Pro, and I have a lot of other content planned for this handheld as well. But without further ado, let's open this thing up and see what's inside. Alright, let's go ahead and get this thing opened. So we'll cut the plastic, and I believe the box opens up on the back, so we'll slide this out. Very nice box. So now if we lift that, and there it is. Oh, I like the color on the metal shell. That looks really nice. Oh yeah, it's got some weight to it for sure. I do like the color contrast of the green with the beige. I think that's really cool. Always like that. And you can see here HX 370 DS 64 gigabytes 2 terabytes. Oh yeah, this thing's definitely got some heft to it. It feels similar in weight to the F1 Pro, I think. I haven't looked up the specs exactly on that, but the weight feels similar. If you look in the rest of the box, we've got some recyclable materials, and then under that this looks like probably a power brick. Oh yeah, that's a nice power brick actually. Real gamers, no gamers. 100 watt. Yeah, I would actually use this. That's pretty cool. And then we've got, oh, there's like international plugs. Yeah, international plugs. And probably a cable. I thought this was supposed to come with additional grips. Is that maybe in here? There we are. So yeah, it also comes with different grip options. So these are smooth with a little bit of dot kind of texture. And then these have ridges like waves. So we'll have to try those out too. Get all that out of the way, and let's open it. Oh, there we go. Very nice. This is pretty comfortable. I like that the controls are right where my thumbs are going to be, at least the top stick and the face buttons. Oh, the face buttons are definitely dome switches. You can feel that. You can probably hear it. D-pad is dome. Got these little sticks. I like that they do these sticks now. These seem to be somewhat standard on AYANEO's devices. Can I pull the cap off? Yes, I can. Okay, yeah, and there's the same cap as the Pocket Ace, which is good because that means it's compatible with AYN Retroid sticks and like other SD sticks. Oh, that's a satisfying close. And the hinge is stepless, which is nice. You can put it at any angle you want, and then it clicks only at the 180 degrees. And then right about there is where it's going to snap closed. Triggers feel basically the same as the Pocket Ace. They're actually a little bit more curved than the Pocket Ace. Like the Ace's, yeah, the Ace's triggers are a little bit more flat. You can see it has like a slight curve up, but the Flip has much more of a curvature there. Shoulder buttons feel about the same. Maybe a little bit more clicky. And the LCRC feels a little bit more clicky as well. 2 USB ports up top, micro SD card flap. Looks nice that it's flush. Dual bottom firing speakers. Got a headphone jack, kind of rare on AYANEO handhelds these days. Where's the power button? I assume that's power actually. Let's go ahead and turn it on. Yeah, so right off the bat, I would say balance is still pretty well centered around the bottom, even though this is metal. It's not like it's top heavy. So that was something I was concerned about with an all metal top shell. So yeah, the sticks, you have really good range, even though that they're fully inset, which is good to see because I am a fan and also not a fan of these sticks. They are good because they don't stick out too much and they're pretty comfortable to use, but at the same time, they can be a little twitchy to where it can be hard to control certain games. Like I can't really play first-person shooter games on those sticks. Of course, Windows. Windows is not very touchscreen friendly. I usually use Bazzite on all my handhelds, but if you use Bazzite, you don't get all the software functionality that AYANEO is built for the dual screen. So one thing I'm noticing is that this ridge here, this edge, is going to feel a little sharp. This rim here actually goes slightly above this plate, so you can feel even more of an edge on kind of both sides of this. I'm not sure how comfortable that's going to be over an extended gaming session. So yeah, definitely something to be interested in. It does kind of start, I can feel it definitely digging into my palms. I would say grip-wise it's comfortable as long as you're using the stick and the face buttons. Like my fingers can kind of spread out, which is nice. At least as the D-pad uses dome switches, we shouldn't have a problem with any false diagonals. These buttons can definitely probably be quieted with some electrical tape. They're not really clacky, so I don't think it needs TPU rings, but we can definitely put tape on the switches to make them a little bit quieter. That should remove almost all the noise. One thing I'm noticing is that the triggers are angled in their travel. When you pull it, it's not flipping straight down, it's flipping about 45 degrees inward. That kind of feels a little weird. Like the Pocket Ace is also similar, but it's not, I don't think the angle is as sharp. So these don't go straight down like other devices like the AYN Odin 2 Portal, but these kind of go this way. Even the Pocket Evo will go straight down. So it's very interesting. I'm not sure how I like that. I don't know if it's a driver thing I need to install, but the little nubbin is not very responsive. It's kind of a pain to use. While that's updating, I'll go ahead and show some of the other accessories I got. So because I pre-ordered during the first week, you get a gift pack. So I got this mouse pad. Feels pretty nice. You got a table. It's nice to put your handheld on so it doesn't get scratched when you're moving it around. And then I think this is a mug. Oh, nice. I think I got a mug when I bought the Pocket Evo. But yeah, these are nice. It's just a mug. And then I did get the case. So even though it's a clamshell, I still kind of want it protected when I throw it into a bag, just because, you know, this is an all metal front, so this could get scratched up by other things in your backpack. The plastic here, they use a softer plastic, or at least a softer coating, which can definitely get scratched in your backpack. So I always like to have a case, you know, even if I know the screens are protected, I want the whole thing to be protected. But yeah, it looks like it fits it perfectly. I don't want to close it because it's updating, but it looks like it fits it perfectly. I think this will be a really good case. Got a nice touch on the handle there. Very nice. So I've had the Flip 1 SDS for about a week and I've got a lot of thoughts about it. So let's explore this device in more detail. We'll start with the controls and go from the top left and work our way around. We have our analog stick, which is in the optimal place for modern games. It's the same TMR sticks as the Pocket Ace and the Pocket S2, and yes, they are small sticks. AYANEO calls them medium sticks, but they're basically the same size as Switch sticks but have more range and feel much better to use. The caps are removable, so you can swap them with other caps from AYN, Retroid, and other Etsy shops. So there is flexibility here, but you do need to make sure that the sticks you use aren't any taller than the stock ones, or you could run into clearance issues when closing the lid. Personally, as someone who typically buys rubber covers because my fingers always slide off most stock caps, I like these caps and I'm gonna stick with them. They have a solid grip and my fingers don't slip off them. These sticks are also very recessed so the lid will close flush, but they have a full range of motion and I haven't had an issue with the movement. However, I did notice that the left stick grinds against the shell when pushing it to the top, which is definitely noticeable and pretty distracting. You would definitely notice it when playing first-person games like Cyberpunk, where you're constantly pushing that stick to move forward. I'm not sure if this is an issue with my unit. I even tried swapping the stick caps, and nope, the grinding is still there. You can see the wear on the stick cap, which is unfortunate. I did have the same issue with my Pocket Evo, which also had that same grinding on the left stick when pushing it up. It took me playing through the entire Metroid Prime Remastered game and constantly moving that stick around the up position to fully break it in, so hopefully over time it will wear in, but it's something I would not want to see on such a premium device. All of the buttons and D-pad on the Flip 1S use dome switches and are pretty quiet considering they're clicky buttons. The D-pad has a shallow travel, similar to other clicky D-pads like from Retroid and AYN. The pivot is also very shallow, but I had no issues with false diagonals. I know the traditional test for false diagonals is to boot up Contra on NES, but I wanted to do something different. Since GBA is my favorite retro system, I created this special GBA ROM specifically for detecting false diagonals. On the left side, we have these arrows which light up when I press a direction, and the middle part has a rolling graph showing the history of my button presses. So I can rock the D-pad left and right, and if I hit an unintentional diagonal, it will show a big alert in the middle of the screen. We can see here that I'm hitting very few false diagonals, which is a good sign. This D-pad is pretty precise as most clicky D-pads are, and you're gonna hear and feel when you roll from one direction to that diagonal. I tried Celeste, and even though I'm not very good at this game, I can hit the diagonals when I want to and not when I don't. I'll chalk up the death to my lack of skill and not because I hit a false diagonal. Rounding out the left controls are the start and select buttons. If you've used other AYANEO handhelds like the Pocket Evo, then you're used to where AYANEO typically puts their start and select buttons. I found it off-putting at first, but over time I've grown to appreciate it. For example, it's really easy to quit out of RetroArch games because I can just pivot my thumb to easily hit both buttons at once. I find with other handhelds where start and select are in the more traditional locations, I have to shift my grip to hit them, so for me I prefer this placement. Along the bottom row, the first button will toggle the overlay on the bottom screen. So if you want to just use the bottom screen and manually manage your windows, or just hide the overlay, you can do that with this button. Next is the home button, which acts as your Steam button or Xbox button and can be remapped in settings. The volume rocker is front and center, and next to it is the power LED and power button. The power button has a fingerprint sensor which works with Windows Hello, and all I can say is that it's very inconsistent at best. Usually I have to put my finger on it at least a few times for it to recognize and log me in. I wish they had used a similar sensor as on the Pocket Evo or Pocket Ace. Those ones work very well, but this one is as buggy as the Pocket Micro one. Same goes for the IR mouse nubbin next to it. It's really difficult to get it to move the cursor consistently, and usually I'll be trying to swipe over it and accidentally touch the bottom screen, which will instantly jump the cursor. Or because you can tap on it to click, I'll be trying to mouse over something and inadvertently click on it, which is pretty frustrating. I just pretend it doesn't exist and only use the left stick to control my mouse cursor. On the bottom right, the AYANEO button will bring up the overlay, which if you've used other AYANEO devices should be very familiar to you. The other button is the Show Desktop button, which does exactly what it says. Then we have the right stick, and finally the action buttons. There's not really any clackiness to the buttons when they pop back up, which is great, and the noise comes from the switches themselves. The travel is also very shallow, so while they feel easy to press and I'm sure it will be easy to button mash, it definitely doesn't feel retro, so you may or may not like that. On the back, we've got the shoulder buttons, which feel very similar to the Pocket Ace. Next to them are the LC and RC buttons, which default to show the keyboard and the escape key, but can be customized in settings. The triggers have a small range of movement, but are light and easy to press without being too light. I can still feather the gas in Forza Horizon 5 and easily maintain an intermediate speed without it feeling like the smallest movement is going to send me into full throttle. The trigger travel is angled at 45 degrees inward rather than typical straight down. This might seem a little odd, but I think it makes a lot of sense for this device, which is a good segue into ergonomics. The Flip 1S is a pretty chunky boy, coming in at about 36mm thick. For comparison, the 3DS XL is about 21mm thick, so the Flip 1S is about 70% thicker than a 3DS. Size-wise, it's not that much bigger than the 3DS, but it definitely dwarfs the DS Lite. It weighs about 660 grams, which is the same weight as the original Steam Deck and 20 grams heavier than the OLED, but like I said during the unboxing, most of the weight is on the bottom half, so it doesn't feel top-heavy. The balance point when fully open is right in line with the joystick and ABXY buttons, which means that when you're playing with the screen tilted forward a bit, you won't ever feel like the device wants to flip out of your hands. My overall thoughts are that this is pretty comfortable to use and the weight doesn't bother me, so if you're not used to that, this might take some getting used to. The plastic is AYANEO's typical soft-coated plastic, which feels very smooth and premium, although this one seems to be a little less smudgy than their other devices. I would still recommend not getting the black if you care a lot about smudges, but the Flip 1S feels very premium, especially with that all-metal lid. Speaking of the lid, I know it's not really possible to color match with the plastic on this Retro Power colorway, but I found it funny that it almost looks like an iPhone rose gold color. These back grips are more like humps, but they go right into your palms, and then your fingers can spread out across the back. They have these little textured diamonds, but they also give you a set of wavy grips, which you can swap out by just sliding these off. They don't change the grip height, just the texture. It also makes it easier when I need to slide my left hand down to reach the D-pad. On a regular handheld, the D-pad should be pushed as far inwards as possible, so your thumb can just pivot down to reach it. We can't do that because of how this device is organized and how big the bottom screen is now compared to the original Flip. So you have to slide your hand down to reach it, but it's still pretty comfortable. I can even still comfortably reach the left shoulder and trigger without straining my index finger, which is good for retro games. I said during the unboxing that I wasn't sure if this rim here would be uncomfortable because it would dig into my hands. You can definitely feel it, but for me when I'm gaming I don't really notice it. I can see how this could definitely bother you, and I do wish that AYANEO had made this more rounded and the edge on the inside less sharp, kind of like the 3DS. It wouldn't have been as clean looking, and I feel like AYANEO was going for a MacBook-like aesthetic, but it would have made it much more comfortable if it were rounded. Now the right stick is interesting because I find myself using the tip of my thumb for the left stick and the base of my thumb for the right. That way it's easier for me to switch between the stick and the face buttons. I still think, like the Ace, it's a little too twitchy for very precision-based aiming, like trying to force someone in Halo Infinite. But it's good enough for games where it's mostly camera control, or if you have an aim snapping feature like Metroid Prime Remastered. The shoulder buttons are easy to reach from any grip position, and I found that it's actually a good thing that the triggers are angled inwards rather than straight down. When you're gripping the device, it would actually be pretty uncomfortable if the triggers went straight down. If I hold the device and demonstrate pulling a trigger mid-air, you can see my finger actually goes down and a little inward. It's pretty uncomfortable if I were to try and force my fingers to go straight down in this position, so I think making them go at an angle was the right decision, especially when your hand is shifted down playing D-pad centric games. Now for the lid, the hinge is stepless and is smooth through the entire range of motion like a MacBook. The D10 only engages at the fully closed and fully open position and will snap open once you get to about here with an audible click. I usually open it up and then set the angle to right before it engages the D10 so it's at a similar angle to the 3DS. If it's all the way at 180 degrees, it feels like the screen is pitched far too back. I'm okay with not having intermediate detents because that's just more parts to wear out over time, but I've been treating this almost like a little netbook because I can just set it on the table, angle the screen just right, and catch up on some YouTube videos. Now let's do an overview of the software experience, specifically ISpace 3.0, because it's similar but also very different from the Android version in many ways, and not just because of the second screen. I know going through the software might not always be interesting, but there's some really cool stuff that's new that I want to show you. On the monitor tab, we can see all the performance metrics as well as change our performance profile. We can see the FPS if we're in a game, TDP, fan, storage, RAM usage, and CPU and GPU stats and temps. Along the top, we have the clock, battery, current charge and discharge wattage rate, and the network statistics. This button brings up the software keyboard, and there's two kinds of keyboards. The default one is your typical phone keyboard, and if you tap on the keyboard icon again, it'll switch to the second one. This one looks more like a desktop keyboard, and it's got keys like tab and control, as well as the function keys, which can be useful. There's also another screen with the arrow keys and some utility functions like copy and paste. The virtual keyboard will also vibrate for each key press, but you can disable that if you want from here. The next button is for the virtual trackpad. It kind of works, but it's also a little buggy. The cursor jumps around and doesn't move smoothly, and I don't know how well it's showing on camera, but the cursor starts flashing anytime you move it. I think what's happening is that when you touch the bottom screen, Windows thinks you're interacting with the bottom screen like a normal touchscreen, but then with this virtual trackpad, the ISpace app is detecting that touch and forcing the cursor back to the top screen to simulate that mouse movement. So every time you move, I think the cursor is constantly jumping between screens and ends up being pretty buggy and inconsistent, and that's why it's flickering all the time. I don't really use this, I just use the mouse emulation with the left joystick, and we'll talk about how that works in a little bit. This sun icon is where we can adjust the brightness of the bottom screen or turn it off. On the performance tab, we can adjust things like the TDP limits and fan profiles. The balanced profile defaults to 12 watts TDP, saving power is at 8, and the extreme is at 15. I'm not sure why the default is 15, I just turned it up all the way to 30. I like to get the max amount of performance from my handhelds, and as we'll see, battery life isn't that great on this anyways, so I'd rather have the extra FPS. The Quick Assistant tab is similar to the Widgets tab on the Android screen and has toggles for things like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, as well as being able to press the Windows key or take a screenshot. The Applications tab lets us add any Windows apps, and I've added a few like Firefox and the GOG client. Finally, the Smart Dual Screen tab is where the second screen magic happens. You can scroll through the active windows and either move them from the top screen to the bottom or move it from the bottom to the top. So if you want to play a dual screen game like 3DS or want to play a game on the main screen and have a guide on the bottom, you can do that. Just be careful though, if you tap on the window name or the X button, it'll close the window completely. Make sure to use the back to main window button on the right to move it back. You can also tap this down arrow and that will hide the toolbars, but you'll always have this little arrow icon on the bottom right, which is how you'll get back into the menus. There's no issue moving windows between screens, although it does not full screen the window on the bottom screen, even if it was already full screen at the top. You can see here that when I hide the toolbars, there's a gap since the window isn't full screen and the desktop background is a little distracting. We can fix that by just mousing over and clicking on the expand button, but the downside is you need to do this every time you move a window. But it does remember that it was full screen on the top when you move it back, so that's good. Hopefully AYANEO addresses this with a software update. If we click the AYANEO button, that brings up the familiar overlay with tabs you're familiar with like Performance, Device, Controller, Quick Assistant, or Widgets, and System. You can navigate these menus with the controller, but for simplicity I'll just tap on the screen so you can see what I'm doing. The System tab is useful because we can quickly check if there's an ISpace update and access Windows things like the Task Manager. Now the tab I want to focus on is the controller tab because that's a large part of the experience and might be the most confusing if you're like me and have never used Windows on a handheld before. For the record, I think AYANEO has done a pretty good job handling controller input. This is like 70 to 80% of the way there, and there are a lot of things that work and some not so much. If we scroll down, we can see the familiar settings like vibration, trigger and joystick sensitivity, and the AVXY mode. The part I want to show you is the top section, which is how the onboard controls interact with Windows and your games. If we tap this icon here on the top right, we can select the controller mode. The Xbox mode, like it sounds, will make it so the onboard controls are recognized as an Xbox controller. This also means that if you need to use the mouse, you'll need to touch the screen directly. Keyboard and mouse mode forces the controls to always emulate a mouse. So the default here is to move the mouse with the left stick, scroll with the right, D-pad is the arrow keys, left mouse is A, and right mouse is X. It might take some getting used to if you're coming from the Steam Deck, where on that device, the right stick is mouse and the triggers are mouse clicks, but I got used to this pretty quick and it's pretty nice. The default controller mode is Custom, which is AYANEO's attempt at intelligently switching between Xbox and mouse and keyboard mode. Depending on the app you're in, iSpace tries to automatically switch to Xbox mode if it detects a game, and generally this works pretty well. If we get into a game like Hades and bring up the overlay, we can see the layout has switched from desktop to game layout, and it shows the game name. Here we can see it also switched to gamepad mode, which is that Xbox controller mode. We could also tap here and manually change it to keyboard and mouse mode if we want, and that would set it for only this game, and it would remember the next time we launch it. So if you have a game that plays better with mouse emulation, this is the way to do that without having to manually switch between controller and mouse mode every time. You just set it once and it remembers. If I were to quit the game or hit the show desktop button, it would switch back to the desktop layout and mouse and keyboard mode as I expect. So generally it works well for 90% of cases. The cases where it gets a little confused is with emulation. I have the latest version of Cemu here, and I've gone ahead and booted up a game, opened the second window for my gamepad view, and moved it to the bottom screen. I also configured the onboard controls as an X input controller in the input settings. Even though Cemu is the currently focused app, if I bring up the overlay, iSpace still thinks I'm in desktop mode, and as you expect, the controls don't work. Expanding the window to full screen doesn't change anything, I'm still in desktop mode. I have to actually go and enter full screen mode in the options menu, and then iSpace will recognize that I'm in a game and set gamepad mode. I could go and manually change the layout to gamepad, and I don't have to enter full screen mode, but that means I have to remember to change it back when I quit Cemu, and that's a hassle and I shouldn't have to do that. So hopefully AYANEO figures out a way to improve the game mode detection to better support emulators. It works just fine for the Steam games I've tested so far, but I know dual screen emulation is a big selling point for this device, so you just gotta remember to go into full screen mode. One thing to note is that I could not find a full screen mode for Melon DS, and here I opened a second window and moved it to the bottom screen and expanded the window. iSpace doesn't detect it as a game, so I have to manually change the desktop layout to gamepad, and I'll have to remember to change it back when I quit Melon DS, which I can only do by tapping the X button here. Good news though, Azahar is the best experience out of these three. With full screen support, the windows are labeled so it's easy to select the secondary screen, and I haven't run into any controller issues. We'll get into emulation performance in a later section, but there's one new feature that I think is really cool and has a lot of potential. It's called Snow Zone, and it lets us freeze and unfreeze our games, and I'll show you how it works. On the overlay, you might have noticed this big window on the left side with these tiles, and if you don't see it on your flip, you can tap this little snow icon here to bring it up. It shows all the active processes including your games, and you can tap on an app to freeze it, which will halt execution. It's a pretty cool concept, and if you're just freezing and unfreezing a single game, it works decently well. Here I can freeze the game, go to Firefox and browse around, and then unfreeze my game and instantly start playing again. It's pretty cool. There are definitely bugs though, like if I unfreeze and Ratchet & Clank ripped apart, I get this weird fast forward effect as if it thinks it's been running the whole time. Also, I was hoping that I would be able to use this to have multiple games running and switch between them by freezing them, but there's some weirdness here too. I can freeze Hades and then launch another game like Celeste no problem, but if I want to switch back by freezing Celeste and unfreezing Hades, I'm not always able to switch back. Sometimes I have to try it again. It's a beta feature, so I don't expect it to work perfectly at launch, but in terms of freezing and unfreezing a single game, it works decently well, and I hope they improve it in the future. The last thing I wanted to cover on ISpace was their launcher, which you can access by long pressing the AYANEO button. I know the Android version gets a lot of hate, and I also don't use it, and on PC handhelds I typically use Steam Big Picture and Bazite. This one seems to work much better than their Android version, where it actually downloads the box art and metadata, and it detects and launches my Steam and GOG games no problem. It's pretty bare bones but functional, so if you're looking for a simple built-in way to launch your games, I'd give this a try. The last thing I'll talk about in this launcher is the Smart Control tab. On the controller section, we can edit all the layouts that come with the system, as well as create new ones if you want to map them to specific games. There are a bunch of other settings, but we'll go down to the device section. Things like charge policy can be changed in the overlay, but the interesting one here is VRAM size. The default is only 4GB, and since I have 64GB of total system RAM, I'm curious as to whether changing this will have an impact in games. If you want to see a video comparing different VRAM sizes, let me know in the comments. One thing to note about Steam Big Picture mode is that it suffers from the same problem where ISpace still thinks it's in desktop mode. So while I can use my D-pad to navigate through my games, if I press the A button, it would actually send a mouse click to wherever my cursor is, which might not be on the tile I'm selecting. It's a weird experience where even though I have the same familiar UI from the Steam Deck, I can't use it like a Steam Deck unless I manually change it to gamepad mode. Okay, let's see how far we can push the Flip 1S. We'll go through some synthetic benchmarks and then show a few games, and I ran everything in the extreme performance profile with the TDP set to 30 watts and 100% fans. Speaking of the fans, there are a few different profiles we can choose from, and here we have mute, balanced, max, custom, and 100%. Mute and balanced are very quiet, and there's no coil whine, similar to the Ally X's fans. Max will scale the RPMs up more as the device gets hotter. 100% bumps up the noise all the way to around 68 dB, which is loud, but again little to no whine as I can tell, just a loud whooshing sound. Overall, the fan is pretty quiet and won't overpower the speakers. The first test I ran was Crystal Disk Mark, and these are the results. If you're not familiar with what these numbers mean, I'll explain them in terms of how they affect the gaming experience. The first test shows speeds for large files, such as installing games or loading cutscenes and large assets, and this result is great for AAA gaming. The second and third test shows throughput for texture streaming, making open world games like Forza and Cyberpunk feel smooth, and also direct storage asset streaming in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. And with these numbers, you should have no issues playing those kinds of games. The last test is where this SSD shows its weakness. On a typical desktop NVMe drive, the read speed on this test would be around 60 to 80, so 45 here is a little low. This affects system responsiveness, so think boot times, launching apps, and save and load times might be a little slower than what you might be used to, although it's not like I personally noticed any major slowness in my daily use, so I wouldn't worry too much about this. This SSD is excellent for gaming and won't be a bottleneck. Moving on to 3D Mark tests, we'll start with Night Raid. But before running these tests, first we want to right-click on the desktop and go into AMD Adrenalin. Make sure your drivers are updated and then go to the Gaming tab, Graphics, and I recommend using the HyperRX profile. This optimizes games for performance and low latency, and I was getting really bad performance and stutters when I had originally set this to quality. Night Raid is a test that shows how well Indian esports games would run, and a 26K score means that you should have no problems hitting max frame rates in games like Hades or Hollow Knight. Here we're running at well over the max 144Hz refresh rate of the display. A score of 3780 in Time Spy means we should expect 40 to 60 frames per second in DirectX 12 games. In Forza Horizon 5, we're at 1080p high settings and easily hitting 60 FPS. And in Cyberpunk 2077, we're at 1080p low with FSR 3 balanced, and we're hitting that 50-ish frame rate. However, as you can see, we start around 52 to 54 FPS, but for some reason, after a while, the frame rate starts to drop. Eventually, it gets down to the mid-30s, which is a very substantial drop. Why is that? The answer lies in the next test. If we run the Wildlife Extreme stress test, we can see that we do start out with a very strong 7000 loop score, but over time it degrades heavily to the mid-4000s. This leads us to thermal performance. The tests fail with only a 63% thermal stability rating, and in order to pass you have to hit 97%. If you've been paying attention to the bottom screen metrics so far in this video, we can see the temps for both the CPU and GPU. As the temps rise above about 75 degrees Celsius in Cyberpunk, the device starts to thermal throttle, and our frame rate tanks. Temps on my device usually top out at around 85 degrees, but that's still very hot for a handheld, and you will definitely notice it. And it's not just the internals that get hot. If we look with a thermal camera, we can see that the device becomes very hot to the touch, specifically the area around the left side of the bottom screen. The hottest spot is right around here at about 60 degrees Celsius, which is about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It's very uncomfortable, and while you won't feel it on the left stick, the D-pad is definitely warmer to the touch. It's not to where you're going to burn your finger using it, but it's enough to let you know it's hot. When you're holding the device, the parts where your fingers go aren't hot, so that's good at least. The hot spots on the back are mostly around the vent, which is to be expected. The one thing is that your fingers will probably be covering part of the fan intake, which could make thermals even worse. Even simply idling on the desktop in saving power mode, where we're using just a few watts TDP, the temps are still in the high 50s, so this thing runs hot all the time. Battery life is also not great on this. We'll start with the worst case, which is AAA games like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. We're in the extreme profile, 1080p medium, getting 30 to 40 frames per second, and we only get about 40 minutes of battery life. An HD 2D game like Octopath Traveler 2 in the balanced power profile, 1080p low settings getting 60 FPS, we get about an hour and a half. In Sonic Adventure 2 Battle using the Dolphin emulator with a 3x native upscale in the saving power mode, we get a more respectable 2 hours and 15 minutes. For more lightweight emulation, with Final Fantasy VI on GBA also in the saving power profile, we get about 3.5 hours. And finally, just idling on the desktop, sipping TDP in saving power mode, we get about 4 hours of battery life. The thing to note here is that when you set the TDP, it only affects the CPU, not the GPU. So in AAA games like Ratchet & Clank or Cyberpunk, we are getting that 30-watt CPU power draw, but the GPU is also pulling over 20 watts, which means we're pulling over 50 watts total system power. Since the battery on the Flip 1S is only 45 watt-hours, that's why we're getting less than 1 hour battery life in the worst case. So the reality is you have to either turn down the TDP and graphics settings, play more lightweight indie titles, or play plugged in, which isn't the best experience. Okay, now let's talk about the screens. The top screen is a 7-inch 1080p OLED display that goes up to 144Hz, and the bottom screen is the same as the Pocket Ace, which is a 4.5-inch 1620 by 1080 LCD display at 60Hz. I had originally thought that this would be the same OLED display as the Pocket Evo and the Odin 2 Portal from AYN, but they're actually slightly different sizes, and the Evo's display goes up to 165Hz anyways. The colors on this are very vibrant and saturated. I'm at 80% brightness, and if we see on the title screen for Octopath Traveler 2, there's a lot of detail in the shadows and the highlights aren't blown out and the colors really pop. It looks really good. If we walk through the Japantown market in Cyberpunk, we can really push that shadow detail and really show what OLED brings to the table. I'm not seeing any loss of detail, and the different color lights smoothly transition through the air and reflect off the floors. It feels really immersive. In Ori and the Will of the Wisps, there's no color banding, and the gradients are smooth and there's a ton of shadow detail. I played through the entirety of Ghost of Tsushima in Kurosawa mode, which is their black and white mode, and this game is one that definitely pushes the white and black levels to the max. The sky isn't blown out, and we can see the smooth gradient from the sun and moon to the rest of the sky, and on the ground we can still see the grass detail in the shadows. And here in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, we're in Nefarious City, and all the neon lights and complex shadows look great and really immerse you in the world, and there's still detail in the night sky. This is a really nice display, however, HDR support is not great on the Flip 1S. If we enable HDR, the colors get all washed out and look pretty terrible. In Ori, we've lost all the shadow detail and saturation. This is really unplayable. Calibrating the display didn't make it better either, so I've been playing all my games with it turned off. Now I know people will look at the bottom display and the fact that it's an IPS and not OLED, but this is a really good IPS panel. If you've watched my Pocket Ace video, I showed how good that screen looks when rendering colors. It's very well calibrated and the colors are very similar to OLED. Here we're playing Sonic Adventure 2 Battle on the Dolphin emulator, and I'll run a comparison between the top and bottom screens, and we can see the colors are very vibrant even on the bottom screen. It's really difficult to tell the difference between the two screens in terms of color saturation. You'll only really see the difference when pushing the white and black levels. Here in Ghost of Tsushima, we can see on the bottom screen the doors are crushed to black, but on the OLED screen the detail is faint, but it's still there. I'm really nitpicking here, and Kurosawa mode is really a torture test of black and white contrast, so unless you're constantly pushing heavy contrast areas, the bottom screen is still really good and is more than adequate for retro gaming. You can easily play GBA games on the bottom screen while using the OLED top screen to play movies or YouTube videos. Both displays also get pretty dim. Here I've turned off my studio lights and set the brightness all the way down. The OLED screen is very dim and I could definitely play this in bed. The bottom screen is dim for IPS, but I might just turn it off if I want the darkest experience possible. No issues with light bleed as well. It's minimal on the bottom screen and you will not notice it while gaming. It's pretty difficult to get it to even show up on camera. These are at my default camera settings at 100% brightness, so I don't think you need to be worried about it. Sound is something that is typically a recurring weakness of AYANEO handhelds. For example, the Pocket Evo's stock EQ was pretty bad and I had to root it and use a Dolby module to make it sound better. I would have preferred front-firing speakers, but these downward-firing speakers aren't the worst thing since the sound can bounce off your palms and towards you. My favorite JRPG series is the Trails games, and this is the demo for the remake of the first game in the series, Trails in the Sky First Chapter. These games are a good test for vocal clarity since they have a lot of cutscenes and dialogue. I'm at 80% volume and the dialogue is clear and easy to understand, although I would say the mids are a little muffled.
That's where you're wrong. Even if we are the same age, I was living here long before you. And that makes me your senior.
Octopath Traveler 2 has some really amazing music, and the title screen soundtrack is excellent for testing orchestral sounds. I can hear a little bit of tinniness, not a lot of bass, and the highs are just a little shrill. The speakers are missing a kind of fullness from the sound. On my Pocket Evo, which also has downward firing speakers, it has a much more fuller sound and it feels like an actual orchestra is playing this track, and I don't get that same feeling from the Flip 1S's speakers. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart has a lot of complex sound effects, from the sounds each gun makes to the explosions and collecting bolts. Like Trails in the Sky, the dialogue is a little muffled, but the bolt collecting sound effects, which are more subtle in this game than previous games, are clear and perceptible.
More goons incoming.
Now this is using the stock EQ settings, and since it's Windows, I'm sure you can download all kinds of apps to tune it, but I don't know how to do that effectively. I'm looking at this from a regular person just turning this on and playing games, and for me, the speakers sound good enough for you to enjoy your games. In terms of build quality, I know the big elephant in the room is, how reliable is the hinge? We've seen reports of issues with other hinges, like the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, where the plastic shell around the hinge is cracking months after purchase, even with anecdotally reported light use. If we remember from earlier in the video, the Flip 1S hinge is different in that it doesn't have intermediary detents like the Retroid Clamshell or the 3DS. It's a smooth hinge like a laptop with only a detent at the closed and fully open position. I was concerned that the hinge could become loose over time and wouldn't stay in whatever angle I put it at, or the detents would wear out and not stay closed if I held it upside down and shook it. Over the last few days, I stress tested the hinge by performing over 1,000 iterations of opening and closing the lid, making sure to engage the detents on both the fully closed and fully open positions. I didn't try to force it past the detent. The goal was to use the hinge normally, not abuse or try to break it. I wanted to simulate about a year to a year and a half of usage where you're opening this maybe once or twice a day. I'm happy to report that after this stress test, I have had no issues with the reliability or cracking of the hinge or any of the plastic around the hinge. If we turn the device around, there is this little plastic cover that we can pop off, and under that, we can see there is no cracks anywhere near the hinge. If you're interested in seeing a full teardown, I plan on doing that in a dedicated video along with modding the buttons, so subscribe if you want to see that. But for now, I'll quickly take off the back shell and we can see the hinge mechanism in more detail. We can immediately see that there is no plastic anywhere on the mechanism itself, it's all metal. These little divots are the detents, and if I open the lid, we can see the detent engage at the fully open position. The hinge is only on one side, with the other side for the LCD ribbon cable. I'm not too concerned with this since this is also how the DS and 3DS are designed. Because it's an all-metal hinge, you might get some creakiness in the future after maybe a few thousand openings, but there's a hole on this part of the shell and you can just put a tiny drop of synthetic lubricant and work it in, and that will probably fix it. I know that we won't know what the reliability is for quite some time, but I can say, at least with what I've seen so far and the stress test that I did, I feel confident in saying you should not experience any issues with hinge reliability, with the exception of maybe this plastic piece breaking off, because we've seen one report of that in Discord where a user's plastic piece broke off. Let's start wrapping up with what I think is great and maybe not so great about the AYANEO Flip 1S DS. First off, these screens are excellent. I know people would have wanted to see dual OLEDs, and yes, the top screen is excellent for those vibrant and saturated colors and those deep blacks. But the bottom screen is a very good IPS panel. The colors are almost as good as the OLED panel, and in most cases will be so similar that you'll have a hard time telling the difference. The dual screens open up so many use cases, and I know clamshells are all the rage this year, but I wasn't really a believer until I had the Flip 1S in hand. I enjoy playing games on this more than my F1 Pro, although I'm fully aware that this might be recency bias. Having two displays is great because you can have your game running on the top screen with a guide on the bottom. Or you can play retro games on the bottom screen and watch YouTube on the top. Since the bottom screen has a 3:2 aspect ratio, it's great for playing both 4:3 and 16:9 systems, in addition to GBA. I'll link the video I did showing PS2 games on the Pocket Ace so you can see how they would look like. And obviously dual screen retro systems are a great fit. Ergonomics are also good. The grip humps go right into your palms and you can stretch out your fingers across the back. Since the top screen is higher than your hands, that means you don't have to bend your neck down as much, which makes longer gaming sessions a bit more comfortable. The angled triggers are more comfortable to use and can still be reached when using the D-pad. The sticks are recessed and my fingers don't slip off them even if they are a little twitchy. The speakers are pretty good considering their downward firing with good audio quality, and I can hear all the sound effects and vocals. They're not the best handheld speakers I've heard, but they're more than adequate for gaming. And the hinge is rock solid. Even after my torture test, it's still very tight. Only time will tell if we see any cracks or failures in the future, but for now I don't foresee any issues. However, there are also things I don't like about this device. Thermal throttling is a very real thing, and we saw it in both benchmarks and in actual gameplay. I could stand still in Cyberpunk and watch the frame rate drop and drop. The device also gets very hot, reaching near 80 degrees Celsius while gaming and idling at 60. I'm very curious to see what the thermal pads or paste situation is. Hopefully that can be improved. But for now, thermals are probably the biggest weakness of this device. Battery life is also not great, with AAA games not even lasting an hour. Even something as low intensity as GBA emulation only lasts about 3.5 hours, and I think that really shows how power inefficient Windows is compared to Android. As someone who uses Bazite on PC handhelds to play PC games, and emulation exclusively on Android-based handhelds, it took a bit for me to get used to the Windows handheld experience. We do get all the benefits of Windows, namely compatibility with games that require anti-cheat or third-party launchers. However, compared to Android, emulation feels like a fragmented experience and the transition between apps is not very smooth. Whenever I would quit an emulator, I would have to manually go back to Emulation Station Desktop Edition instead of being able to just set it as my home app on Android and pressing the home button. ISpace does a decent job of trying to bridge that gap and make Windows a little easier to use with a controller, but it still feels very beta. The automatic controller layout switching doesn't work for all games, especially emulators. Right now, it treats every non-game app as the desktop, and I'd like to see a way to customize controls for whatever app is in focus, and not just what ISpace detects as a game. There's definitely improvements that can be made to the dual screen management, such as automatically full screening windows when you move them to the bottom screen. Snow Zone is a really cool feature, and I hope AYANEO fixes some of the bugs so we can have true multi-game switching. Overall, there's still a lot of jankiness and smaller bugs that I didn't have time to cover, or this video would be 2 hours long. Sometimes just launching Cyberpunk would crash my system, or unplugging the power cable would make the screen go blank, all kinds of weird issues. I think ISpace could be really great on Windows, but I have to judge it based on what the experience is now, not what it could be, and I wish AYANEO had baked this software more before they released the Flip 1S to production. So what do you guys think about the AYANEO Flip 1S DS? Let me know in the comments. Are you going to order one or are you going to skip it? I know I had a lot of criticisms about this device, but in the end I still remain optimistic. Most of the issues aside from the thermals can be fixed with software, so we'll have to see if AYANEO can improve the experience over time. If they can improve controller detection in non-games like Steam Big Picture, then we might be able to treat this as a console-like experience that happens to have a full desktop behind it. This also makes me really excited about the upcoming Pocket DS, since it's basically a slightly thinner Android-based version of the Flip 1S. The ergonomics on this are great, and the fact that I can use the D-pad and still easily hit the left shoulder and trigger are very promising for retro games, but I hope the cooling works better on the DS. I have it on pre-order as well as the AYN Thor, so I'll do a big comparison video once I have all three. The next video I plan on doing is a final review of the Pocket Ace, but after that I'll do a teardown on the Flip 1S and we'll see if I can fix the thermals and reduce that thermal throttling. Also let me know if you want to see a comparison video between the 1X Player F1 Pro since they both use the HX370. But with that, thanks for watching and have a great day.